unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. Indian federalism is encountering some of its biggest challenges since the early years of the Republic. Relations between the Union government in New Delhi and the states are rocky, to put it mildly. India's better-off states are growing increasingly agitated about a system of fiscal federalism in which richer states end up subsidizing poorer, more backward ones. The new Goods and Services Tax, or GST, has attracted fresh criticism because its benefits have not been shared equally by all states. And the coming fight over how parliamentary seats will be allocated across states has only added fuel to the fire. To discuss this brewing crisis in Indian federalism, especially the economic aspects of the current situation, I'm joined today by the economist Arvind Subramanian. Arvind is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He also served as the chief economic advisor to the government of India between 2014 and 2018. Arvind and his colleagues have authored an excellent new article in Economic and Political Weekly reviewing the 7-year record of the Goods and Services Tax. Many of our listeners will remember that Arvind, while he was CEA, was the author of an important government report on the revenue-neutral rate that facilitated the implementation of the GST. To talk about this new article and his broader thinking on Indian federalism, I'm pleased to welcome Arvind back to the show. Arvind, thanks for taking the time.
Milan, great to be back.
So I want to start with your new piece. You and several co-authors have a new essay in a recent issue of EPW, and we will link to that on our show notes. And essentially, this piece takes a stock of the Goods and Services Tax, this massive new reform that was brought into being in 2016. It's been more than 7 years since it came first into force. And so I want to get into some of the details about this new system and how it's working. But before we get into that, maybe we should just rewind for a second. This idea of a unified nationwide goods and services tax, this is something that economists like yourself, other policymakers, politicians, they've been discussing and debating really for 2 decades before it actually came into being. Summarize for us, if you could, the kind of intellectual, the concept, right, behind the GST. Why was it seen as such an important and desirable reform in the Indian context?
Yeah. The GST, just to clarify for listeners, it's called the GST in India, the Goods and Services Tax. But actually what it is a value-added tax, the VAT, which has been popular around the world since the 50s and 60s. And the IMF has kind of made it its mission to get all countries around the world to adopt this VAT, the value-added tax. The benefits of the value-added tax are several. First of all, because it allows firms not to pay taxes on inputs, it doesn't distort production decisions. It's a consumption tax, and it has this lovely self-policing quality whereby agents at the upper end of the chain have an incentive to ensure that documentation downstream is maintained so that they can get their tax credit. So the value-added tax is now well recognized as an absolutely vital part of every country's tax system, of course, except the United States, which is the only country that doesn't have it. So in India, there's been an intellectual consensus, as you said, Milan, for about 2-3 decades, starting with the great Raja Chellaiah, who used to be an IMF economist. And India indeed started implementing the VAT selectively, first by the center. There were various forms of value-added tax called the mod VAT, and then the states in the early 2000s, each of them adopted the value-added tax. But what was truly remarkable and almost revolutionary about this is exactly what you said, is to get an integrated nationwide tax, which would have 2 benefits. One, uniformity. No matter where you are, you pay the same taxes. And second, also to get rid of taxes on the flow of goods between states, so you get one market. So the unification and creation of one market and the simplification across all states was the big achievement of the GST in India.
So, Arvind, can you just give us an example? Like, if you take a sector, like, say, like the footwear industry or something, right? How does this actually work in practice, right? If you're a manufacturer of, say, sneakers or something, right? I mean, how does it, could you just give us a kind of concrete sense of how you mentioned input, outputs, where is the tax actually getting paid?
I think it's useful, first of all, Milan, to know that before the GST, if, say, sneakers were being produced, say, in Maharashtra, typically there would be an excise tax on that levied by the center, which the center would collect. And then Maharashtra would apply a value added tax on it, especially if it's sold in Maharashtra itself. The sneaker factory buys leather, say, from Kanpur in another state. Right. Under the old system, it was not very clear whether the inputs on the taxes on inputs being paid would actually be borne by the producer and then passed on to the consumer or not. And that would be very, kind of uncertain. But now under the new system, what happens is no matter where you get your leather from in India, whatever taxes that are levied on the leather and borne by the producer of footwear, he will then just say no. Since I have since the leather manufacturer has paid these taxes, I should not have to pay these taxes. And therefore, I will only pay taxes on the value that I add, which is, whatever it is, net of the input costs. And that's what I will charge the final consumer. So in that sense, it kind of makes the tax much more seamless, much smoother, and also reduces the final burden on consumers.
So I realize that for some of our listeners, the finer details of tax policy might appear, rather daunting. The Indian tax code is not a simple beast. But I want to just kind of hammer on kind of one of the conceptual pieces that you mentioned, right? You have elsewhere described the GST as an example of cooperative federalism or pooled or shared sovereignty. And I wonder if you could just help us understand why the GST was so revolutionary from the perspective of India's federal design.
So prior to the GST, Milan, 29 states and the center, of course, now there are 28 states, but there were 29 states then. Each state could decide what the tax would be on, going back to your example, on leather and footwear. So in Maharashtra, it could be 10%. In Tamil Nadu, it could be 20%. And then also each state could decide, what input could be kind of taxable, what input is not taxable, whether a small manufacturer would be taxed. And this could vary across states. And also, most importantly, if these things went across states, they would be taxed under what was called the central sales tax. Now, the taxes that each state was levying was about 50% of its total revenue. And the equivalent taxes that the center was levying was about 1/3 of its total revenue. So when the GST comes along, every state and the center says that I no longer have the right to determine how much, how, where to tax these things. But now it's going to be done collectively by all of us together in the institution that was created, the GST Council. So that's the sense in which all the states and the center gave up their, right and sovereignty to do what they wanted on these indirect taxes and said, we'll do it collectively. Now, so in that sense, you could, to crudely quantify it, the states were giving up, quote unquote, 50% of their fiscal sovereignty and the center about 1/3. And it's quite radical, Milan, if you think about this, because when this happened in 2016, Brexit had just happened, and people said, oh my God, the whole tendency it's towards deglobalization, getting away from cooperation. And this was a fantastic counterexample where states were saying no, and the center, in the common interest of creating a common market, a simpler tax, we will give up our sovereignty. Now, I think a lesser known point here is that you give up the sovereignty not just to levy taxes, but one of the dirty secrets was that states like Gujarat under Narendra Modi, who were hesitant about the GST, were also giving up the sovereignty to not impose taxes and to give away these taxes to attract investment. So Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, so both the sovereignty to impose and the sovereignty to not impose were being given up under the GST.
So, I want to kind of get into the details of your paper right now. And you and your co-authors have kind of 5 major findings, and I want to touch on them one by one. The first big finding is that, when the system was put into place, there were all sorts of predictions of essentially the GST creating a kind of enormous revenue bounty, right? And what you find is that those expectations have not been realized. In fact, if you look at revenue accrued under the GST as a share of India's GDP, it still has not surpassed the equivalent set of taxes in the pre-GST era, right? And I think just if we could start there, I think many people might be surprised by that, Arvind, because every month we open up the newspapers or we look on social media, and there's somebody touting the fact that, GST revenue has hit an all-time high and it's surpassed, July is better than June and June was better than May and so on and so forth. So what exactly is going on the revenue side?
Yeah, it's true, Milan, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, every month the headline numbers have been rising, soaring even, and that's given the impression that the tax is doing very well in revenue terms. I think the misconception arises from 2 reasons. One, the headline numbers are always in rupees, and if there's inflation, for example, obviously the tax will go up, and people sometimes forget that. But the second critical reason is that the headline number was what we call collections, what the taxes are being collected. What was being overlooked was that an important chunk of that was being given back to exporters in particular as refunds, so that the net amount accruing to the central government and the state government were much less than the headline number. The headline numbers were showing that, in fact, even as a share of GDP, taxes had surpassed pre-GST levels. But when you took into account refunds, that was not the case. Now, the reason for a long time these taxes were well below the pre-GST levels and have now only slowly converged to pre-GST levels for one very, very important reason, Milan, essentially that after the tax was implemented in 2017, in the GST Council, with the connivance of the center and the states, India went on a rate-cutting rampage. Essentially GST tax rates, which were roughly 14% when the tax went in, but today are about 10.5%, maybe 11%. So there's been a massive cut in rates, which actually reduced revenue collection. So the fact that now revenues have come back, despite the rate cutting that's happened, shows there have been some improvements in efficiency. So that's the good news. The bad news was that because of the rate cutting, revenues kind of deteriorated quite sharply. The good news is that despite having done that, improvements in the efficiency of the system have brought tax revenues back to where they are. But certainly it's not been the bounty and the bonanza that people expected initially, because, rates were cut very sharply. So there was no Laffer curve working here. You cut tax rates, you lose revenues.
But Arvind, let me just kind of try to, disentangle just kind of 2 things, right? Because the GST was criticized from the outset because of its complexity, right? It's not as if there was one tax rate on all goods and services. There were multiple slabs. And so you would get these bizarre stories, like if you were eating in a restaurant in a non-air conditioned part of the restaurant, your food would be taxed at one rate. But if you were in the opposing room, which had air conditioning, then you would get a slightly higher rate. But what you're saying is what took place was not necessarily a rationalization, but rather just an across-the-board slashing, presumably for political reasons, right? I mean, obviously politicians want to be able to go to their voters and say, look, we cut taxes for you.
Yeah, I think, Milan, we have to separate out two things. What the complexity of the GST system, how that has impacted collections, which is probably negative, but I don't think we have a good quantification of that yet. But that's probably not as important as the sheer fact of having cut rates substantially. So, if you go from 14% incidence to 10%, that's a 4 out of 14, like a 30% reduction in taxes. So I think it's the cutting of taxes, tax rates, that's been the main reason why these have come down. We'll talk about the simplification later, but I think that's the main. And now the question is, why did India embark on this rate cutting rampage, I would call it? I mean, you identified one a reason, which is that, heading into the 2019 election, every politician wants to cut rates. But there was another very important reason that facilitated this, which is, and we're going to come to that next, which is that states were given a guarantee that no matter what happened, they would see a steady 14% increase in revenues. So once that, was a feature built into the system, states basically said, let me get the political benefit of cutting rates and going to the taxpayer and saying rates are being cut without facing the revenue consequences and this is what we call moral hazard, and this kicked in spades during the transition period of the GST.
Okay, so let's just go there directly, right? Because it's linked to your second finding, which is that notwithstanding the overall disappointing kind of numbers on the revenue side, India's states have done actually quite well under the GST, and that has to do with, as you just alluded to, the way in which states were compensated, right? So tell us a little bit about this bargain with the central government, right? What was the nature of the quid pro quo, and how did states and the center fare once this quid pro quo was set into motion?
Milan, first of all, the quid pro quo was not so much a quid pro quo as when the GST was being implemented, some states feared that they would lose revenue because the nature of the tax was being altered from a tax previously based mostly on production to now a tax based on consumption, so that broadly the expectation was that, richer producing states would lose and poorer consuming states would benefit, like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. And that was why, if you recall, the states that were opposing the GST were Gujarat, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, the manufacturing states.
Right, these are the more industrialized states that produce a lot of goods and services.
And were collecting taxes based on that production, under excise and so on. So to reassure some of these states, the GST was designed saying, look, for a 5-year period, all states will be guaranteed a minimum 14% growth as the reassurance that, or as the buy-in to implement the system as a whole. The expectation was that the GST system would do so well that maybe you wouldn't need to provide that compensation guarantee because the system would do well. But in the event, what happened was not only were taxes not buoyant, we had this massive COVID shock, which just led to a collapse of revenues. And that's why the compensation guarantee proved to be so important and so beneficial to the states. And so to go back to your question of what happened, who gained and who lost in the transition period, because states got 14% guarantee, their tax to GDP ratio rose substantially. And we calculate that states gained about 0.5 percentage point of GDP on average every year compared to the pre-GST system. And of course, the counterpart loss, which I think the states sometimes forget, was borne by the center. because it was the center that its share of what would have got the compensation revenues were forked over to the states. And of course, over and above that, because of COVID, the center took a loan on behalf of the states to meet this 14% guarantee. So during the transition, the states did very well because of the compensation guarantee, and the center lost out.
Are you curious about India's economy, politics, culture, and history, and hungry for rigorous analysis of its most pressing challenges? Tune in to Ideas of India, the podcast that's becoming the go-to source for smart thinking on Indian political economy. Hosted by Shruti Rajagopalan, Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. You can hear from top experts in economics, law, and social sciences such as Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Anne Kruger, Arvind Subramanian, and many others. Explore cutting-edge ideas shaping India's political economy from young academic scholars, and connect with a community of forward-thinking intellectuals. Ideas of India offers invaluable insights for anyone invested in India's progress. Subscribe now to Ideas of India and be part of the conversations driving India's future. New episodes are released every 2 weeks and are available on all major podcasting platforms. Transcripts of each conversation are also available at mercatus.org/Ideas of India. So, you said that on average, states saw a bump of about a half a percentage point of GDP. But, of course, not all states fared the same, right? Whenever you have a federal system like India's or America's or Brazil's or so on, there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. Now, you said earlier that some of the producing states, the Maharashtras, the Tamil Nadus, the Gujarats, were quite nervous. What do we know in your analysis about which states have actually gained and which have actually lost when we look back at the first 7 years of this new reform?
So a great question, Milan. And the answer to that, surprisingly, is during the transition, virtually no state received less revenue as a share of GDP relative to the pre-GST system. Because think about it, if it grows 14% on average and GDP is growing much less than 14%, your tax to GDP ratio is rising in that period. So in absolute terms, because of the guarantee, virtually no state lost. Of course, what did happen was some states gained more than other states. And that's true. There is variation. And it turns out that what is surprising is that, almost mechanically, Milan, those states that grew slower, their GDP growth was slower, actually gained more because their revenue grew faster at 14%. So the slow growing states perversely gained the most in this transition because the 14% revenue guarantee kicked into action.
So as we think about the future, one of the things that you and your co-authors write at the very end is that in terms of its revenue promise, the GST, after a shaky start, could yet have a very happy ending, but a lot of hard work lies ahead, right? So maybe let's just turn to the future. What are some of the fixes or reforms? What is that hard work that you'd like to see applied such that India can realize the full potential of this massive change in taxation?
Yeah, I think two in particular stand out for me, Milan. One is what you alluded to, that the rate structure has become absolutely complicated. We saw recently, if you remember, in Coimbatore, a hotelier stood up and told the finance minister that, if I come in and order a bun, I pay no taxes. But if I order a cream and bun, I pay 12%. So, customers should basically bring their cream, order the bun and pay no taxes. And of course, the finance minister took offense at this challenge of the GST system. And this sort of thing is absolutely rampant. I mean, I cannot tell you, Milan. See, remember that when the GST was, being implemented, I wrote a report on what the rate structure should be. Vijay Kelkar previously wrote a very good report as well, saying that there should be one tax. I kind of recognize that, in India, so much diversity, so many pulls. That's a kind of pipe dream. And so I recommended basically 2+1, 3 rates, 2 rates, a lower rate, a standard rate being where most of the goods are taxed, and a rate for what we call, the luxury goods or demerit goods, cars, tobacco, etc., etc. But in practice, it is just proliferated. Just, the taxes on demerit goods. I mean, there are just, if a cigarette is X inches long, you pay one tax. If it's X plus Y inches long, you pay another tax. Tobacco, if you chew, you pay one tax. If you don't chew it, you pay another tax. How the hell do you know who's chewing the tobacco and who's not chewing the tobacco, right? So this kind of thing is rampant, and I think we need to just simplify it and get it back to 1 or 2 rates. But the other more difficult task is, if you've cut rates and you want to raise revenue, you have to raise some rates as well. So especially at the lower end, you have to raise rates in order to get revenue back on track. And I feel a bit despondent, to be honest, whether these things can be done, because essentially we lost, during the early years, kind of the constitutional moment, as it were, principles like simplicity, right, should have been adopted with kind of evangelical zeal and fervor, and not to be kind of, but the GST Council has become a little bit like a kind of market in which everyone is saying, I want a lower tax. And it's become an asymmetric market, not where some are saying raise some and others are saying lower some. Everyone is cutting rates, wants rates to be cut. So in this atmosphere, how are we going to get either simplicity or higher rates is kind of really an open question, and something I think drastic will have to happen for us to move in that direction.
But Arvind, let me just kind of bring this back to the federalism point, right? Because when you read commentary about, say, the Modi economic record or the performance of the GST, not your piece, but I'm just saying, broadly, there is always a view towards castigating the center, saying, this government really rolled this out in such a sloppy manner, and it was very ham-handed and very rushed, and, it just kind of bloated and out of proportion. But aren't the states also, shouldn't they take 50% of the blame? Because after all, the GST Council is a construction of the center and the states, right? And I assume, as you were in the room, so you can tell me, that some degree of state level politicking is what's led to this explosion of complexity.
Actually, Milan, that's absolutely a very important corrective and lesson here. I mean, the center has been blamed for a lot of the weaknesses and deficiencies in the system, and the state center does deserve some of the blame, especially some of the way in which it's handled the politics, the way unilateral decision making has happened, and so on. But the states, I think the two things that the states have to be reminded of is, one, they did very well in terms of revenue during the transition, especially when COVID hit. Had they not had this compensation guarantee, their revenues would have. Second, they were completely complicit in the rate cutting, right? And therefore, going forward, it's therefore both up to the states to make the GST Council a more rational place where you can have rational and symmetric discussions on raising rates, as well as, you see, Milan, here's the kind of slightly puzzle, political economy puzzle, right? That one advantage of collective governance here is that when you take decisions to raise taxes, if you were to do it on your own in a state, you face political heat and flack. But when you do it collectively, presumably some of the blame for that should get deflected onto the collective entity, as it were. And that dynamic has not been at work. And that, I think, is kind of a slightly subtle political economy thing that we need to reflect upon a little bit more.
But Arvind, I mean, you could make that point more broadly, right? I mean, a lot of things that we lament the state of health, education, law and order. I mean, these are all state subjects at the end of the day, right? But we think about it as, well, the center has failed on X, Y, and Z. But in fact, right, I mean, the center has some role to play, right, because of the way of centrally sponsored schemes work, the way the policy works. But at the end of the day, the states are the ones who have primary jurisdiction, right? So this is not just something that relates to taxes. It's kind of across the board thing.
Yeah. One thing, Milan, I should have mentioned earlier is that, look, the fiscal sovereignty point is the loss of sovereignty is not unimportant. I said that the states gave up 50% of their sovereignty. So essentially, Milan, the thing is, states, the big tax handles that they left with are basically alcohol and petroleum. These are the ones where they have, because the rest is part of this pooled sovereignty that they have. But I think it is up to them now to say, we take this pooled sovereignty seriously, because it's not just a state problem, it's a national problem, and therefore to do this collectively at the level of GST Council. But I think that this should probably we should segue into the broader kind of fiscal federalism problems that we're seeing, which go beyond the GST is kind of one manifestation, but there are, as you know, broader fiscal federalism issues that are looming large in India today.
Let me just ask you one last thing before we do that segue, which is, you have a recommendation in this paper about the future of the compensation cess, right? So this guaranteed compensation the center was providing to the states is now over, that period, but there is this compensation cess which has been out there, in part which has been used to fund that. What should the role of that be going forward?
Yeah, our recommendation very simply is that the revenues from the compensation cess is not insubstantial. It's about half to about 3/4 of a percentage point of GDP. So you cannot abandon or eliminate the cess altogether. So what we've said is just basically roll that into the GST structure as the rate on, because the cess is basically levied on the demerit goods, the fancy cars, the tobacco, and so on. Fold it into the broader GST rate structure and treat it like any other GST rate, which is 50% to the center, 50% to the states, and treat it like any, because you need that revenue from the cess to make sure that going forward, you maintain revenue buoyancy in the GST system as a whole.
All right, so let's now take a step back from this issue of the GST and taxation, because as you pointed out, it's really just one element of a larger ongoing tussle between the center and the states. Aside from GST, we have seen in recent weeks, months, years, many southern states have expressed concern that the prevailing system of fiscal transfers, namely funds that are transferred from the center to the states via the Finance Commission, which is this independent technocratic body that is set up every 5 years to try and determine how much of the central kitty should be devolved down to the states. Many of the southern states, which have done quite well economically, believe that the formula used to determine those transfers unfairly punishes them and unfairly rewards poorer states who are less well governed, who haven't industrialized, and so on, right? So there's a sense of resentment building up by which many states are saying, look, we are putting far more into the kitty than what we're getting out, whereas those guys over there are not putting as much in, but they're making out like bandits, right? So just characterize for us, if you could, what is the nature of the kind of political conflict at play?
Milan, I think we have to separate these out into two sets of issues. One is the grievance that all the states have against the center, which is what we call vertical devolution, which has, I think, many manifestations, but two big ones stand out. One is that the center has kind of flouted the spirit of the recommendations of the Finance Commission. Because remember, the Finance Commission said many years ago, 42% of the kitty should be given to the states. The center de jure followed that, but over time has started levying what are called cesses. You just call something a cess, and then you don't have to share it. And so it has de facto violated the spirit and started imposing these taxes mainly on, petroleum and things, which it keeps for itself and doesn't distribute to the states. And the states have chafed under this quite considerably.
And we should just remind our listeners that, the big change that came into play with the 14th Finance Commission, which issued its recommendations in 2014, was that of the central revenue, the kitty, 42% should go to the states. And that was a 10 percentage point increase. So that was seen as a really big pro-devolution, pro-decentralization move. And what you're saying, Arvind, is that technically the center has adhered to that. But in fact, because they've introduced all of these surcharges, these cesses, which are centrally collected, that they don't have to share, the kitty that gets devolved is much smaller, right? Because they've created other pockets of revenue that they can kind of jealously hold on to themselves.
Exactly. So, and the other way in which they violated the spirit was, although the 14th Finance Commission said you have to give back to the states 42% from 32%, what the center turned around and said, look, we are implementing some programs for you, which are called centrally sponsored schemes. Before the 14th Finance Commission, roughly 90% of the costs of these schemes were borne by the center, and 10% was borne by the states. But it clawed back, de facto by telling the states, well, from now on, you have to contribute 40% or a much higher number than before, so that de facto, the states had less kind of money to play with for themselves as a result of this. So the combination of these cesses and the center saying, if you want to benefit from these centrally sponsored schemes, you better cough up a bigger share, so that the states had less free money, untied money to devote to its priorities. And what was particularly irksome for the states was many of these schemes were in areas that were the constitutional responsibility of the states, and that made it doubly irksome. So that's the vertical part, which is a kind of common grievance of almost all the states, and kind of broadly along non-partisan lines. But then there's the between states problem, or what we call the horizontal devolution problem, which is what you mentioned, Milan, which is that, over time, what has happened is the richer states, because they've been growing faster, the formula that the Finance Commission has tended to increase the redistribution component of what is being transferred from the richer states to the poorer states. And so it's like they believe that India is becoming a open-ended transfer union from. Now, remember that the reason this is, remember, it's not just South versus North. It's both the South and the West and Haryana who are the richer states who've been making these de facto, what we might call redistributive transfers. And so this has become a big play. And the other thing, of course, is that it's become more salient for the South because it's come on all these political, developments that have happened, because the centralization of power by this government and wielding that power has created resentment. And so many of the southern states have said, look, not only are we kind of, the political power is being used in a very unilateral fashion, on top of that, we're making these transfers to the poorer states. And the most kind of incendiary kind of expression of that was, a few months ago by the Karnataka politician Suresh. He said, look, we generate the revenue and we get to keep very little of that. So that notion that we generate the base for taxes, but those taxes are being redistributed to other states because the Finance Commission formula is pretty redistributive, kind of equity oriented, because it's based on population and a number of equity type features. It leads to this redistribution. So I think, to be fair to the southern states, what they're saying is that not that we're against some kind of redistribution, but that it should not be open-ended, it should not be consistently rising, and there should be some limit on that, because at the end of the day, that can also create moral hazard on its own, making the other states make less of an effort to raise their own resources. So you cannot have open-ended redistribution and large magnitudes of redistribution. I think that's broadly what the southern states are expressing now.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So, I think one of the things that makes this development and this moment so interesting is the way in which the southern states, but as you mentioned, it's not just the southern states, it's the southern states and several others, the richer, better performing states, they are acting collectively to try and develop or project a united front vis-a-vis the center and vis-a-vis the Finance Commission. The 16th Finance Commission is underway, and they will be doing their work. And at some point, we'll have to put out a report indicating their recommendations for how these issues should be handled in the future. And, it's interesting when you go back in time and you look at states and how they behave. They've tended to behave very, very narrowly, right, to ensure that their interest was protected vis-a-vis the center, but never really stop and look at, whether or not what happened in Tamil Nadu affects Andhra, or what happens in Jammu and Kashmir matters for people in Delhi, or so on and so forth. Does this level of collective action across states, including states, by the way, that are not governed by the same political party, right? I mean, a lot of these southern states are governed by, a raft of regional parties. Does that surprise you?
No, not at all, Milan. Let me say why. I think there are three big reasons why it's not surprising me anymore. First, we've spoken about there's the broader context. I think 10 years of rule by the BJP, the sense that, power is very centralized, that, all kinds of things are being done, which are unilateral, heavy-handed, whether it was COVID, the GST, the agriculture. So that sense that, we're talking about more how power is being wielded counter to a spirit of cooperative federalism. I think is one factor. The second factor, Milan, which you've written about a lot, is what is looming ahead. Basically delimitation. That if, political representation, which was frozen in time in 1971, as you well know, if that is opened up again and political representation now conforms more broadly to population, then we know that's going to be an alteration of political power against the better performing, economically performing, slower demographically growing southern states to the benefit of the Hindi heartland. So that, I think, is looming large. I think the third and subtle point, Milan, is that, as you said, in the past, this was never an issue. States didn't care. We had limited resources. It was being shared, etc. I think what has changed dramatically now is economic growth has made the kitty so buoyant, so robust, that states have become aware of that, especially the richer states, that in the past, when you didn't grow, didn't have the resources, you didn't care. You were willing to share everything. But now, what the Karnataka politician was expressing was that, look, we've been growing Chinese style for 30, 40 years. Our tax base has been growing, and yet we don't keep. So that awareness that, resources resources have become more buoyant has created this awareness. So I think these three are coming together, and because there's some common interest in the southern states, which also happen to be, in and out non-BJP states, it's that thing, all of these coming together, the context, the looming wedge between political representation and economic performance, the fact that now resources are being generated much more buoyantly in some states, all of this is coming together to create this common front, which I think is kind of like a perfect storm of grievance against the center and against the status quo arrangements, which I think they're trying to want to modify in the current circumstance.
But, Arvind, when it comes to the claims or the demands or the requests of these richer states, I guess I just want to push you a little bit to help us understand, what they're asking for, right? And how we should think about the trade-off between fairness and equality. Because whenever, again, you have a union of states, there's going to be some degree of inequality in terms of taxes and transfers. I think of my own country, the United States. We see that playing out in spades, obviously. And, the poor, the Bihars, the Uttar Pradeshs could say, well, actually, you guys in Karnataka, you guys in Tamil Nadu are using our labor from our states to do blue-collar work, to do construction jobs, because your citizens who are better off in terms of a per capita GDP basis, are going to the service sector or whatever, right? So, these are very complicated things. And isn't it true that there's also this push and pull, which is, the southern states, right?
Yeah.
They are getting things from the north also.
Exactly. So I think that what you rightly point out, Milan, is that the southern states cannot view this purely from a fiscal perspective, because there are larger benefits to being part of one common market, one union. You spoke about, getting cheap labor from other states, but also, there's a market in other states for the goods produced by these states as well. And there are other benefits as well. So I think the southern states are very acutely aware of that. And to be fair to them, there are some kind of extreme expressions of this incendiary, but broadly, they absolutely subscribe to the fact that there are lots of benefits. So what their ask is not that this equity, the balance between equity and fairness be radically altered. So their request is that at the margin, you should tilt it a little bit more so that the redistribution component doesn't just keep rising over time continuously, that there's some limit on how much redistribution, and maybe there's also a gradual decline in a way that's politically sustainable for the southern states as well. So very concretely, what that ask is to say, look, give us back at least some amount based on the tax base that we generate. So, in one of the criteria that they say should be included in the horizontal formula is just the share of every state in total GDP. So, if I, Karnataka, say I'm generating 8% of the taxable base of the country, which is GDP, at the moment, I get back something like 3% or 4%. So what they're saying is that, increase that to some extent so that what we contribute and what we get back are not identical, but there is some proportionateness between that, and also to ensure that the redistribution doesn't keep rising over time, and just to limit that. So it's a kind of calibrating at the margin the trade-off between equity and fairness, rather than eliminating the need for some basic equity in the provision of services across states, which is what the Finance Commission is meant to look into. All states should have enough public resources to provide a broadly comparable level of goods and services to its citizens. You respect that, but in a way that doesn't get excessive, doesn't get politically sustainable, and doesn't create moral hazard also from the recipient end.
You mentioned already the kind of third piece of this, which is about political representation, right? So in addition to the question on taxes, fiscal transfers. There's this question of political representation. There is a freeze on delimitation, which comes to an end after 2026, and that could result in a real shift of political power away from the South and in favor of the North, for the simple reason that, related to the fact that the Southern states have done very well, their fertility rates have come down significantly, right? In most Southern states, the total fertility rate now is below replacement level. Now, it's also true that in the northern states, the poorer states, fertility has also plummeted pretty significantly. But of course, there's still a wedge between the North and the South, even though ultimately it seems like they're moving towards a convergence. So I guess, Arvind, maybe just as a kind of final thing to ask you, it seems like the ingredients are in place to have a kind of grand federal bargain, right? I just wonder, if you could leave us with, how do we tackle these things simultaneously? Because it seems like if you deal just with the taxes issue, it's really an incomplete solution because you have the fiscal issue. But you can't really solve the fiscal issue without giving some reassurance on the political issue, right? So, is this a moment for something akin to, what we had in 1956, the States Reorganization Commission, where we really sort of had to sit down and grapple with multiple cleavages at the same time? How do you see this kind of playing out in the months and years to come?
Yeah, I think that's a good grand note to end on, Milan. Just one, Milan, clarification for listeners. You've kept using the word North and South. We have to be a bit careful because it's the Hindi heartland rather than the North. Correct. Because Punjab and Haryana are very similar to, especially Haryana, Correct. To the southern states. So just that small clarification. Right,
and just to add to that, we'll link in the show notes to the analysis that we've done, which is now 5 years old, looking at how delimitation could play out if it was done simply on the basis of population. And clearly the states that would do the best are not all northern states, but it's states like Bihar, UP, Rajasthan, and the states that would lose the most, if you reallocated political representation only on population, would be states like Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, and so on and so forth. But yes, this is really, it's more complicated than a simple north-south divide.
Yeah. But coming back to this, whatever the grand issue. So, Milan, I don't want to overcomplicate this, but part of the grand bargain, I think you said, there's the tax, there's the fiscal transfer side. Third, there's the political representation. And then, of course, the fourth issue, which is looming more and more large, is migration, large migration. We saw in COVID how much, migrant labor there is. And Milan, a new and interesting phenomenon, because I was in Kerala recently, is that, in Kerala, it has 3 million immigrants, Malayalis in the Gulf and elsewhere. But there are almost 3 million, or maybe a bit more than 3 million non-Malayali immigrants from the rest of India in Kerala who are now, and the character is changing. It's not just circulatory labor, because now families are coming and settling. So this is going to become a more and more important issue and this is true for the other southern states as well, where, there's a lot of labor from Jharkhand, West Bengal, the Northeast coming in. So I think internal migration will have to be a fourth pillar of this. Now, having said that, I do think that this is a good moment to have kind of a fresh look at all these issues together, because it seems to me that you cannot get a solution on delimitation without some give and take on the other side as well. So, for example, one element of a grand bargain has to be that if the Hindi heartland gets more political representation, then the southern states then say, well, then some of the redistribution that's taking place under the Finance Commission, for example, that will have to be partially reversed so that we get to keep a little more, so that we don't just lose on the political side, but also on the fiscal side. So I think there are elements of that. Similarly, on the migration, what kind of cooperation do we need on the welfare state, on the social safety net? Who gets to bear the burden of looking after these migrants, as it were? That also has to be. So in that sense, I would say so. And tying it back, Milan, last point is that for all its problems, the GST Council has been one cooperative federalism structure that meets on an ongoing basis. You at least talk and talk and talk. We need to, I think, kind of create that broader institutional structure where we get to talk and talk and talk about a broad range of issues so that you can have trade-offs amongst these issues as well. Now, unlike you, I don't think new institutions have to be created per se. I just think that the governments in power need to, starting the dialogue. I mean, on this, there's nothing that prevents the center from saying, look, let's talk on all these issues, create some kind of arrangements to do that. But that you need these broader discussions to cover a wider range of topics so that you can make the trade-offs that, so that everyone feels that each one is getting something. I think maybe the crying need of fiscal federalism today.
Well, I think, just to elaborate one final thing, your example of the southern states and others like Maharashtra, Haryana banding together to try and discuss and perhaps project a common or united front vis-a-vis the center and the Finance Commission is a good example, right? There's no institutional structure. A chief minister, in this case, the chief minister of the state of Karnataka, has taken it upon himself to write to, I think, 8 other chief ministers to have a kind of ongoing set of convenings to discuss this, right? I think I think the institutional solution is an interesting one worth thinking about, but it almost also can be a kind of easy cop-out, right? To say, well, we need a GST-like council thing for this thing, and we need a GST-like council thing for this issue, and then you get this proliferation of entities. And the fact of the matter is there have been councils set up in the past to help bring the center and the states together, and frankly, they don't have a great track record, right? If you think about the National Development Council, the Interstate Council, even arguably Niti Aayog, right? These things have not fostered the kinds of discussions that you're calling for right now.
Yeah. And one last thing, Milan, on this, just to add, is that exactly, just as nothing has prevented a bunch of states from getting together and articulating this and forcing discussion, nothing prevents the center from doing similar things as well. It has to be a case where basically all parties are aware and recognize what's at stake, and then, start coming together to find more cooperative solutions to these things. So, what I'm trying to say is that you need a broader climate of openness and non kind of centralizing, non-unilateral, more inclusive decision making on the part of the center and on the part of the states as well.
My guest on the show this week is the economist Arvind Subramanian. He's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He also served as the chief economic advisor to the government of India between 2014 and 2018. He is the co-author with Varun Agarwal, Devashish Deshpande, Josh Fellman, Tirtha Sara Reji, I hope I said her name right, of a new piece called GST Revenue Performance, Gainers and Losers After 7 Years. It was published in the September 14th issue of Economic and Political Weekly, and we'll link to that in our show notes. Arvind, thanks so much for taking the time. I think we covered the whole gamut of issues that we set out to do. Always nice to talk to you.
Thanks for having me, Milan. Great to be here.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grant Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.